The sound of bones cracking between hungry jaws echoed through the narrow alley behind the Golden Rose Saloon, and Josephine Owens knew she had maybe 10 minutes before someone discovered her breaking the unwritten rule about encouraging strays in Custer, South Dakota. The year was 1876, and the town had grown harder with each passing month since gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, transforming a rough settlement into something meaner, something that had no patience for soft hearts or wasted scraps. Josephine had arrived 3 months ago with her widowed aunt, who owned a modest boarding house on the edge of town, and in that time she had learned to keep her head down and her kindness hidden. But every evening when the saloon kitchen tossed out bones and gristle, she found herself sneaking behind the building with whatever bread or meat she could spare from her own meager meals. The 3 dogs that had claimed this particular corner of Custer were a motley collection of survivors. The largest was a brindled mutt with one scarred ear and ribs that showed through his patchy coat. The smallest was a terrier mix, quick and nervous, who always hung back until the others had taken their share. The third was a hound with soulful eyes and a limp that suggested a wagon wheel or a cruel kick had damaged her back leg beyond full repair. Josephine crouched in the dust, her simple gray dress pooling around her boots, and watched them eat with a satisfaction that seemed ridiculous given everything else that demanded her attention in this harsh place. "You know the sheriff fined a man $5 last week for letting dogs congregate near businesses." The voice came from behind her, and Josephine startled so badly she nearly dropped the cloth bundle that still held a few more scraps. She spun around, her heart hammering, and found herself looking up at a cowboy who had somehow approached without making a sound. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in spring. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his hands rested easy on his gun belt in a way that suggested he knew how to use the weapon but was not particularly eager to do so. Dust covered his boots and the lower half of his trousers, and she could smell horse and leather and sweat. "I did not know anyone was watching," Josephine managed, getting to her feet and brushing futilely at her skirt. Her heart still raced, not entirely from the surprise. She had seen this man before, riding through town with a small group of ranch hands, but they had never spoken. Most cowboys passed through Custer without paying much attention to the women who were not working in the saloons or dance halls. "I was not watching," he said, and something in his voice made her believe him. "I was heading to the livery stable and heard you talking to them." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been talking to the dogs, crooning soft encouragement and telling them they were good, brave creatures who deserved better than the world had given them. It was a habit she had developed as a child on her father's farm in Ohio, before the war had taken him and disease had taken her mother, leaving Josephine with only Aunt Marjorie and the long journey west to a territory that felt as foreign as the moon. "They are just dogs," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew how defensive they sounded. "Just dogs," he repeated, but he was not mocking her. He stepped closer, and the hound with the limp approached him cautiously, sniffing at his extended hand. "I had a dog when I was a boy. Cattle ranch in Texas before the war. He was just a dog too, but he pulled me out of a flooded creek when I was 8 years old. Broke through ice to do it." Josephine watched him scratch behind the hound's ears with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the gun on his hip and the hard planes of his sun-weathered face. "What happened to him?" "Got old," the cowboy said simply. "Died in his sleep by the fire, which is better than most creatures get in this world." They stood in silence for a moment, and Josephine became acutely aware of how improper this was, standing in an alley alone with a man she did not know. Aunt Marjorie would have a fit if she discovered it. But something about the way he looked at the dogs, and then at her, made her feel less foolish for caring about things that most people in Custer considered beneath notice. "I am Nathaniel Frost," he said finally, straightening up and touching the brim of his hat. "I work at the Bar 7 Ranch about 12 miles north of here." "Josephine Owens," she replied, and then, because it seemed important, "I live with my aunt. She runs the boarding house near the church." "I know the place," Nathaniel said. "Clean beds and honest prices, or so I have heard." "My aunt believes in both," Josephine said. She clutched the empty cloth bundle against her chest, suddenly uncertain what to do with her hands. The dogs had finished eating and were settling into the shade cast by the saloon's back wall, their bellies marginally fuller than they had been 10 minutes ago. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and Josephine had the strange sensation that he was seeing something other people missed. The same way she had learned to spot which horses at the livery stable were gentle despite their size, or which men in town were mean drunks despite their sober civility. "You have a heart worth keeping close," he said quietly. "This town will try to harden it if you let it." Before she could think of how to respond to such an unexpected statement, he tipped his hat again and walked away, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust with each step. Josephine stood frozen for several heartbeats, watching him disappear around the corner toward the livery stable. Her pulse had not quite returned to normal, and she could not entirely blame it on the scare he had given her when he first spoke. The hound with the limp looked up at her and thumped her tail once against the ground, as if to confirm that the stranger had been acceptable. Josephine laughed, a short breathless sound, and shook her head at her own foolishness. She gathered up the cloth and hurried back toward the boarding house, where dinner preparations awaited and Aunt Marjorie would want help with the guests. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the small room she called her own, Josephine replayed the encounter in her mind. "You have a heart worth keeping close." What an odd thing to say to a stranger. But then, everything about Nathaniel Frost had seemed odd in the best possible way. Most men in Custer were either prospectors driven half-mad by gold fever, businessmen concerned only with profit, or cowboys who spent their wages on whiskey and card games before riding back to their ranches. Nathaniel had looked at her like she was someone worth seeing, and he had spoken to those dogs like they mattered. She told herself firmly that she was being ridiculous, that one brief conversation in an alley meant nothing, and that she would probably never speak to him again. Custer was small, but the distance between a boarding house girl and a working cowboy might as well have been the distance between the earth and stars. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, she dreamed of Texas and cattle ranches and dogs sleeping by fires. The next day brought the usual round of chores. Josephine helped Aunt Marjorie strip and remake beds, beat dust from rugs, scrub floors, and prepare meals for the 5 men currently boarding with them. 2 were miners who worked claims in the hills and came back each night exhausted and silent. 2 were merchants waiting for shipments of goods from the east. The 5th was an older gentleman named Mr. Harrison who claimed to be writing a book about the Western Territories, though Josephine had never actually seen him write anything. He spent most of his time smoking a pipe on the front porch and pontificating to anyone who would listen about the manifest destiny of the American people. By late afternoon, Josephine's back ached and her hands were red from washing water, but she had learned not to complain. Aunt Marjorie had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, and if the work was hard, well, it was honest and it kept them fed. The boarding house had a reputation for cleanliness and decent food, which meant they stayed full enough to pay their bills and save a little besides. "I need you to take these to Mrs. Chen at the laundry," Aunt Marjorie said, handing Josephine a bundle of linens that had stains too stubborn for their own washtubs. And stop by the butcher on your way back. Tell him I will need a good roast for Sunday dinner, and it better not be tough like the last one, or I will take my business elsewhere." Josephine nodded, grateful for the excuse to get outside. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the October chill that came with the afternoon shadows and headed into town. The streets of Custer were busy with the usual traffic of wagons, horses, and foot travelers. Somewhere a hammer rang against metal, and she could hear the tinny sound of a piano from one of the saloons even though it was not yet evening. The town had a temporary quality, as if everyone expected it might disappear as quickly as it had sprung up, and no one wanted to invest too much in making it permanent or beautiful. Mrs. Chen's laundry was in a small building squeezed between a gunsmith shop and a general store. The older Chinese woman had come to Custer with her husband and sons, planning to mine for gold, but had quickly discovered that washing other people's clothes was steadier work and less likely to kill you. She had a sharp eye for stains and a gift for getting white linens actually white, which made her popular despite the prejudice that made life harder for Chinese families in the territory. "Your aunt, she is good customer," Mrs. Chen said when Josephine entered with the bundle. "Always pays on time, no arguments about price. Tell her these will be ready Thursday." "I will tell her," Josephine promised. She liked Mrs. Chen, who treated her with a brisk kindness and sometimes gave her advice about getting stains out of fabric. "How is your family?" "Busy, Mrs. Chen said, but she smiled. "My eldest son, he is talking about opening a restaurant. I tell him, one business is enough, but he does not listen. Young people never listen." Josephine left the laundry smiling and headed for the butcher's shop. The streets were starting to clear as people headed home for supper, and the angle of the sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. She was thinking about what Aunt Marjorie wanted her to prepare for tomorrow's breakfast when she heard shouting from the direction of the livery stable. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Custer was full of shouting men, and Aunt Marjorie had made it clear that nice girls did not involve themselves in rough business. But something in the tone made her hesitate, and then she heard a yelp that sounded distinctly canine. Without consciously deciding to do so, she found herself hurrying toward the noise. Behind the livery stable, she discovered two boys, probably no more than 12 or 13 years old, throwing rocks at a dog. It was the terrier mix, the nervous one who always hung back at feeding time. The dog was trying to escape, but was cornered between the stable wall and a pile of old lumber. One of the boys had a rock the size of an egg raised above his head, and the look on his face suggested he meant to do real damage. "Stop that!" Josephine shouted, and her voice came out harder than she had known it could. "Stop that right now!" The boys turned to look at her with expressions that mingled surprise and defiance. "It is just a stray," one of them said. "Pa says strays carry disease and ought to be driven off." "Then drive it off," Josephine said, advancing on them with her hands clenched into fists. "There is no need to hurt it." "What do you care?" the second boy asked, but he lowered his rock slightly. "You are that boarding house lady, and you are being cruel for no good reason," Josephine said. She reached the terrier and scooped it up, ignoring the way it trembled in her arms. The dog was lighter than it should have been, all bones and fear. "Go home. If I catch you throwing rocks at animals again, I will tell your fathers exactly what kind of boys they are raising." The threat probably carried no real weight, but something in her face must have convinced them she meant business. The boys exchanged glances, muttered something that might have been an insult or might have been an excuse, and slouched away. Josephine stood very still until they were out of sight, and only then did she allow herself to start shaking. "Well," said a familiar voice, "you are just full of surprises." She turned to find Nathaniel Frost emerging from the livery stable, and from the look on his face, he had witnessed the entire confrontation. He was carrying a saddle over one shoulder and had hay stuck to his shirt, suggesting he had been tending to his horse. "I cannot stand cruelty," Josephine said, and was annoyed to find that her voice shook slightly. The terrier was still trembling in her arms, and she could feel its rapid heartbeat against her chest. "No," Nathaniel agreed, setting down the saddle. "I can see that." He approached slowly, the same way he had with the hound yesterday, and examined the terrier with careful hands. "Looks like they did not hit it, at least not hard, mostly just scared." "I scared it too," Josephine admitted. "Charging in like that, you protected it," Nathaniel corrected. "That is different." He looked up at her, and the expression in those creek water eyes made her breath catch. "Those boys are the sheriff's nephews, by the way. They are used to getting away with whatever they want." "I do not care whose nephews they are," Josephine said, and meant it. Nathaniel's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "No, I do not suppose you do." He reached out and scratched the terrier behind its ears, and the dog's trembling began to subside. "Are you going to take it home with you?" Josephine had not thought that far ahead, but now that he said it, she realized she could not simply put the dog down and walk away. "My aunt will have something to say about it." "Most aunts do," Nathaniel said. "But seems to me this little one needs someone willing to stand between it and rock-throwing boys." "Where are the others?" Josephine asked, suddenly worried. "The hound and the big brindled one." "The hound has been following me around all day," Nathaniel admitted. "I gave her some jerky at lunch, and now she seems to think we are partners. The big one, I saw him this morning near the general store. He looked all right." They stood there in the lengthening shadows, and Josephine became aware that she was holding a dirty stray dog. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she had completely forgotten about going to the butcher's shop. Aunt Marjorie was going to have questions. "I should go," she said, but she did not move. "Probably," Nathaniel agreed, but he did not move either. "Thank you," Josephine said finally. "For yesterday, I mean, for not reporting me to the sheriff about the feeding." "I would not do that," Nathaniel said, and he sounded almost offended that she would think it. "Besides, you are doing a good thing. This world needs more people willing to show kindness to things that cannot repay them." "My father used to say that," Josephine said, surprising herself. She rarely talked about her father, and never to strangers. But somehow Nathaniel Frost did not feel like a stranger, even though she had known him for less than 2 days. He said you could judge a man's character by how he treated creatures that could not fight back. "Your father was wise," Nathaniel said. "He was also dead by the time I turned 14, Josephine said, and the old bitterness crept into her voice. "Killed at Gettysburg, fighting for a cause that did not bring him back to us." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. "My father made it through the war but came back different. Angry all the time, jumping at noises, seeing enemies where there were none. He died 5 years later when his heart gave out. The doctors said it was his heart anyway. I always thought the war killed him, just took longer than a bullet would have." "I am sorry," Josephine said, and meant it with her whole heart. "Me too," Nathaniel said. He reached out and gently took the terrier from her arms. "Tell you what. I will take this one back to the ranch for tonight. My boss will not mind, and I have a shed where it can sleep safe and warm. You talk to your aunt, and if she says no to keeping a dog, well, I will figure something out." "You would do that?" Josephine asked, surprised by the offer. "For the dog," Nathaniel said, but the way he looked at her suggested that was not the only reason. "And for you, Miss Owens." The sound of her name in his mouth did strange things to her composure. "Josephine," she said. "You can call me Josephine." "Nathaniel," he replied, though she already knew his name. "Most people call me Nate." "I like Nathaniel better," Josephine said, and then felt foolish for saying it, but Nathaniel just nodded as if she had said something profound. "Then Nathaniel it is." He tucked the terrier more securely against his chest. "I will be back in town in 3 days. Will you be feeding the strays again tomorrow evening?" "Probably," Josephine admitted. "Then I will bring this one back then, and we can see how your aunt feels about house guests of the 4-legged variety." He tipped his hat to her one more time and headed for the livery stable, carrying the terrier like it was something precious rather than a half-starved stray. Josephine watched him go, her heart doing complicated things in her chest, and tried to remember all the reasons why she should not be feeling this way about a cowboy she barely knew. She could not think of a single convincing reason. By the time she made it to the butcher's shop, placed Aunt Marjorie's order, and returned to the boarding house, it was nearly full dark. Aunt Marjorie met her at the door with a look that suggested she knew something unusual had occurred, which was unsurprising given that Aunt Marjorie seemed to know everything that happened in Custer within hours of it happening. "Mrs. Patterson saw you confronting the sheriff's nephews behind the livery stable," Aunt Marjorie said without preamble. "She said you were holding a stray dog and talking to that cowboy who works at the Bar 7. Josephine decided honesty was probably the best policy, at least partially. "The boys were throwing rocks at a dog. I made them stop. Nathaniel Frost happened to be there, and he offered to take the dog out to his ranch for the night." "Nathaniel, is it?" Aunt Marjorie's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "And when did you become acquainted with Mr. Frost?" "Yesterday," Josephine admitted. "He saw me feeding the strays behind the saloon." She braced herself for a lecture about propriety and reputation, and the dangers of letting cowboys think you were available for courting when you had no dowry and no prospects. But Aunt Marjorie just studied her for a long moment, and whatever she saw in Josephine's face made her sigh instead. "The Frost family is well regarded in these parts," Aunt Marjorie said finally. "Nathaniel's father ran a ranch in Texas before the war, and the family has a reputation for honest dealing. Nathaniel has been working at the Bar 7 for 2 years now, and Mr. Thompson, who owns the ranch, speaks well of him. He is not a drunk or a gambler, and he sends money home to his mother in Texas every month." Josephine stared at her aunt. "How do you know all that?" "Because I am not deaf and blind, girl," Aunt Marjorie said tartly. "I keep track of who is who in this town. It is good business and it keeps us safe." She paused and her expression softened slightly. "Is he courting you?" "No," Josephine said quickly, and then, more honestly, "I do not know. We have only spoken twice." "Twice is enough to start," Aunt Marjorie said. "Your uncle and I only spoke once before he asked my father permission to court me, and we were married 6 months later." Josephine had heard stories about Uncle William, who had died of cholera 10 years ago and left Aunt Marjorie a widow at 30. The older woman had never remarried, despite having opportunities, and Josephine had always admired her fierce independence. "If he comes around," Aunt Marjorie said carefully, "and if his intentions are proper, I have no objections to you receiving him. But Josephine, you need to understand that cowboy work is hard and dangerous. It is not a life for everyone." "I know," Josephine said, even though she did not really know anything about what it meant to be a cowboy's wife, or even if Nathaniel was thinking about her in those terms at all. For all she knew, he was just being kind because he liked dogs. But 3 days later, when Josephine was behind the saloon with her bundle of scraps and Nathaniel appeared out of the dusk with the terrier trotting at his heels, the look in his eyes suggested dogs were not the only thing on his mind. "She ate 2 full meals and spent yesterday chasing mice in the barn," Nathaniel reported, crouching down beside Josephine as the three dogs greeted each other with wagging tails and playful nips. "She is tougher than she looks." "Most females are," Josephine said, and Nathaniel laughed, a warm sound that made something in her chest feel lighter. "I suspect you are right about that," he said. He pulled a wrapped bundle from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "I brought extra roast beef from the ranch cook." He is inclined to be generous to people who rescue dogs from rock-throwing idiots. "You told him?" Josephine asked, accepting the bundle and unwrapping it to reveal thick slices of well-cooked meat that would make a feast for the three strays. "I told everyone at the ranch," Nathaniel said, unapologetic. "You should have seen young Billy's face when I described you marching up to those boys like an avenging angel. He said he hopes he finds a woman that brave one day." "I was not brave," Josephine protested, feeling her cheeks heat. "I was just angry." "Bravery is not the absence of fear," Nathaniel said. "It is doing what is right even when you are angry, scared, or both." He watched her divide the meat among the three dogs, making sure the smallest got her fair share. "Did your aunt agree to let you keep the terrier?" "She said we could not afford to feed a dog when we have human mouths to feed," Josephine admitted. "But she also said that if a certain cowboy wanted to provide supplies for a dog who might happen to live in our shed, she would not object to such an arrangement." Nathaniel's grin was bright enough to light the alley. "Is that so? Well, I happen to know a cowboy who would be happy to make such an arrangement, provided he could visit said dog regularly to check on her welfare." "I think that could be arranged," Josephine said, trying to sound prim and failing entirely. She could not stop smiling. They sat together in the dust, watching the dogs eat, and talked about everything and nothing. Nathaniel told her about the ranch, about the cattle drives and the long days in the saddle, and the peculiar beauty of dawn breaking over the prairie. Josephine told him about Ohio and her father's farm, about learning to read from her mother's old books and dreaming of becoming a teacher before circumstance had brought her west instead. They discovered they were both 22 years old, that they had both lost family to the war and disease, and that they both believed animals deserved kindness. "Would you walk with me?" Nathaniel asked when the dogs had finished eating and settled into a contented pile of fur and full bellies. "Just around town, properly where people can see us." It was a clear statement of intent, a declaration that whatever was happening between them was something he wanted others to know about. Josephine's heart hammered, but she nodded. "I would like that." They walked through Custer as the evening turned to night, and if people stared, Josephine found she did not care. Nathaniel kept a respectful distance between them, but he talked to her like her thoughts mattered, like she was someone worth knowing beyond her ability to scrub floors and make beds. When they reached the boarding house, he tipped his hat to Aunt Marjorie, who was sitting on the porch with her knitting, and asked formal permission to call on Josephine on his next day off. "You may," Aunt Marjorie said, looking him over with sharp eyes, "provided your intentions are honorable." "They are, madam," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "I can promise you that." After he left, riding back toward the bar 7 on a sturdy chestnut horse, Aunt Marjorie looked at Josephine with an expression that mixed concern and approval. "He seems like a good man." "He is," Josephine said, and believed it with everything in her. "Good men are rare," Aunt Marjorie said, "but so are women brave enough to confront bullies for the sake of a stray dog. I think you might be well matched." Over the following weeks, Nathaniel came to town every chance he got. Sometimes it was just for an hour after work, barely enough time to walk around the block together and talk until the sun set. Sometimes it was his day off, and they would spend the whole afternoon together, always properly chaperoned by Aunt Marjorie or in public view. Josephine learned that Nathaniel had two younger sisters still in Texas, that he loved horses more than cattle but appreciated both, and that he dreamed of having his own ranch one day, something small but prosperous, where he could raise quality stock and maybe a family. "You want children?" he asked her once as they sat on the front porch of the boarding house, the terrier asleep between them. It was a bold question, the kind that suggested he was thinking about futures rather than just present moments. "I do," Josephine said honestly. "I always thought I would make a good mother, though I suppose everyone thinks that about themselves." "You would be an excellent mother," Nathaniel said with absolute certainty. "I have seen you with those dogs. You have patience and firmness both, and you do not shy away from protecting things smaller than yourself." "What about you?" Josephine asked. "How many children does a future rancher need?" "As many as God sees fit to provide," Nathaniel said, grinning. "Though I would hope for at least two." Only children can be lonely. They were courting, Josephine realized. Truly courting, with the intention of marriage hanging unspoken but understood between them. It should have frightened her, how quickly things were moving, but instead it felt right in a way nothing else in her life ever had. When Nathaniel looked at her, she felt seen. When he talked about the future, she could picture herself in it, not as an afterthought or a convenience but as an essential part. Winter came early to the Black Hills that year. By late November, snow was falling regularly, and the temperatures dropped low enough that Josephine worried about the dogs. The terrier, who she had named Sadie, was safe in the boarding house shed with blankets and regular meals. The hound, who Nathaniel had started calling Molly, had taken up semi-permanent residence at the Bar 7 and slept in the bunkhouse to the amusement of the other ranch hands. But the big brindled male, who proved too skittish to let anyone close enough to catch, still roamed the streets of Custer. "I see him every few days," Josephine told Nathaniel one afternoon in early December. They were in the boarding house parlor, sitting by the fire while Aunt Marjorie entertained Mr. Harrison with her opinions on the territorial government. "He looks thinner. I leave food for him, but I do not think it is enough. Winter is hard on strays," Nathaniel said quietly. "You cannot save them all, Josephine." "I know," she said, but it hurt her heart to admit it. Nathaniel reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, right there where Aunt Marjorie and Mr. Harrison could see. It was a statement, a public claim, and Josephine felt her breath catch at the boldness of it. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I have ever met," he said. "I hope you know that." "It gets me into trouble," Josephine said, trying to make a joke of it. "It makes you extraordinary," Nathaniel corrected. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Josephine saw something in his face that made her pulse race. "Josephine, I need to say something, and I cannot wait any longer to say it." "All right," she managed, acutely aware of Aunt Marjorie's subtle attention despite the older woman's apparent focus on her conversation. "I love you," Nathaniel said simply. "I have loved you since I saw you in that alley feeding strays when anyone with sense would have walked on by. I love your kindness and your courage and the way you see the world. I want to build a life with you, if you will have me." Josephine's heart felt too large for her chest. "Nathaniel, I know I am just a cowboy," he continued, the words tumbling out like he had been holding them back for too long. "I do not have much to offer yet, but I have been saving my wages, and Mr. Thompson has said he will sell me breeding stock when I am ready. I can give you a good life, Josephine. Maybe not a rich one, but an honest one. I will work hard for you and any children we might have. I will never raise my hand to you, and I will spend every day trying to deserve the gift of your heart." Across the room, Aunt Marjorie had stopped even pretending to talk to Mr. Harrison. The older woman was watching them with an expression Josephine could not quite read. "You already deserve it," Josephine said, her voice shaking. "You have had my heart for weeks now, Nathaniel Frost. I love you too. I want nothing more than to build a life with you." The smile that broke across Nathaniel's face was like sunrise. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with such tenderness that tears pricked Josephine's eyes. "Then I will speak to your aunt formally, and we can make plans." "You have my blessing," Aunt Marjorie announced, abandoning all pretense of not having been listening. "Though I expect you to do this properly, Mr. Frost. My niece deserves a proper engagement and a proper wedding." "She deserves the world," Nathaniel said, still holding Josephine's hand like it was something precious. "I will do my best to give it to her." They were married in February of 1877 in the small church at the edge of Custer with half the town in attendance. Josephine wore a dress that Aunt Marjorie had helped her sew from cream-colored silk that had cost more than she wanted to think about, and Nathaniel wore a suit borrowed from Mr. Thompson that was only slightly too short in the arms. The ceremony was simple and sincere, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed her with a sweetness that promised more for later, when they were alone. Mr. Thompson had given them 3 days away from the ranch, which they spent in a small but clean hotel room in Rapid City. Josephine had been nervous about the wedding night, having only the vaguest understanding of what happened between husbands and wives, but Nathaniel was patient and gentle, and by the second night, she discovered that intimacy with someone you loved was less frightening and far more wonderful than she had imagined. "I want to make you happy," Nathaniel whispered to her in the darkness, holding her close. "Every single day for the rest of our lives." "You already do," Josephine said, meaning it absolutely. They returned to the Bar 7 as husband and wife, and Josephine discovered that ranch life was every bit as hard as Aunt Marjorie had warned. She and Nathaniel lived in a small cabin that had previously housed a bachelor ranch hand, and while it was clean, it was also drafty, cramped, and miles from town. The work was endless cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, tending a garden, helping with the chickens and the dairy cow that Mr. Thompson allowed them to keep. Her hands, which had been soft when she first came west, grew calloused and rough. Her back ached most days, and her dresses bore patches on the patches, but Josephine had never been happier. Nathaniel came home to her every evening, tired and dirty but always smiling when he saw her. They ate simple meals together by lamplight and talked about their days. They made love in their narrow bed and held each other through the cold nights. Sadie and Molly both lived with them, and the 2 dogs became as much a part of their little family as any creatures could be. In May, Josephine realized she had missed her monthly courses for the second time. She told Nathaniel over breakfast, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her, and then he let out a whoop that startled both dogs and made her laugh. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she pleaded dizziness, and then he set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Nathaniel said. He knelt down in front of her and pressed his face to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I already love you more than I knew was possible." Tears streamed down Josephine's cheeks, the happy kind that she could not seem to stop. "We are going to have a baby," she said wonderingly. "We are going to have a family," Nathaniel corrected, standing up and pulling her into his arms. "You, me, 2 dogs, and however many babies come along. We are going to build something good here, Josephine. I promise you that." The pregnancy was not easy. Josephine was sick most mornings through the first few months, and as summer turned to fall, she grew ungainly and uncomfortable. But Nathaniel was attentive and loving, taking on extra chores without complaint and rubbing her swollen feet every evening. Mr. Thompson's wife, a practical woman named Sarah, visited regularly to check on her and share advice from her own experiences with 5 children. "The first one is always the hardest," Sarah said cheerfully. "But you are strong, and Nathaniel will not let anything happen to you. That boy is devoted to you like I have rarely seen." The baby came in January, during a snowstorm that kept the doctor from arriving until after everything was over. Josephine labored for 14 hours, with only Nathaniel, Sarah Thompson, and Aunt Marjorie, who had ridden out from town despite the weather, to help her through it. The pain was worse than anything she had imagined, and there were moments when she was certain she was going to die. But Nathaniel held her hand and told her she was the bravest person he had ever known, and somehow she found the strength to keep going. When the baby finally came, red-faced and screaming, Sarah placed the infant in Josephine's arms and announced, "You have a son." Josephine looked down at the tiny creature in her arms, this impossible human that she and Nathaniel had created, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. The baby had Nathaniel's dark hair and a furious temper that promised he would be a handful. "A son," Nathaniel breathed, looking at the baby with wonder. "We have a son, Josephine. They named him James William Frost after Josephine's father and Aunt Marjorie's late husband. James was a colicky baby who did not sleep through the night for the first 4 months, and there were times when Josephine was so exhausted she cried from sheer frustration. But Nathaniel walked the floor with James when Josephine needed rest, and gradually the baby settled into a routine that allowed all of them to sleep at least a few consecutive hours. By the time James was 6 months old, Josephine had regained most of her strength and discovered that motherhood suited her even better than she had hoped. She loved watching James discover the world, loved his first smile and his first laugh, and the way he reached for Nathaniel whenever his father came home from working the ranch. "He is going to be tall like you," Josephine said one evening, watching Nathaniel play with James on the floor. The baby was trying to crawl, managing only to propel himself backward in frustrated circles. "He is going to be stubborn like you," Nathaniel countered, laughing when James let out an indignant squeal. "Look at that face, pure determination." Life settled into a rhythm that Josephine found deeply satisfying despite its challenges. Nathaniel continued saving money and learning everything he could about ranching. Mr. Thompson, who had no sons of his own, treated Nathaniel more like an heir than an employee, teaching him the business side of running a ranch as well as the practical aspects. By the time James turned 2, Nathaniel had enough saved to buy 20 head of cattle and a small parcel of land about 5 miles from the Bar 7. "It is not much yet," Nathaniel said, showing Josephine the plot of land that would become their ranch. It was rough country, mostly unfenced prairie with a creek running through the southeast corner, but Josephine could see the potential. "But it is ours. We can build here, start small and grow." "It is perfect," Josephine said, meaning it. She could already picture a house, a barn, fences, and maybe someday hired hands of their own. They spent the next year building. Nathaniel and several men from the Bar 7 put up a small house, just 4 rooms but solidly constructed with a real wood floor and glass windows. They built a barn for the cattle and horses, and Nathaniel fenced 5 acres for a garden and chicken coop. Josephine threw herself into making the house a home, sewing curtains and braiding rugs and planting flowers around the front door. They moved to their own ranch in the spring of 1880, when James was 3 years old, and Josephine was pregnant with their second child. The day they moved the last of their possessions from the Bar 7 cabin, Nathaniel picked Josephine up and carried her over the threshold of their new house, laughing when James demanded to be carried too. "Welcome home, Mrs. Frost," Nathaniel said, kissing her soundly while James made exaggerated gagging noises that he had learned from the ranch hands. "Welcome home," Josephine echoed, looking around at the space they had created together and feeling overwhelmingly grateful for the path that had brought her here. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after Aunt Marjorie, and the saloon where Josephine had first fed the strays, arrived in August. Unlike James, who had fought every step of his entry into the world, Margaret slipped into life quietly and peacefully, as if she had decided the whole process was perfectly reasonable. She had Josephine's lighter coloring and a placid temperament that made her an easy baby from the start. "Two healthy children," Aunt Marjorie said when she came to visit and meet her namesake. The older woman was starting to show her age, her hair fully gray now and her movements slower than they had been, but her eyes were still sharp. "You have done well for yourself, girl. Better than I could have hoped when you first came west with nothing but grief and a carpetbag." "I found more than I was looking for," Josephine said, nursing Margaret while James played with his toy horses at her feet. Through the window, she could see Nathaniel working with the cattle, and her heart swelled with love for this life they had built. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Nathaniel proved to have a gift for breeding cattle, developing a small herd known for strong stock that could survive harsh winters. Word spread, and soon cattlemen from across the territory were coming to buy breeding stock. The money was not extravagant, but it was enough to hire a few hands, expand the herd, and put aside savings for the future. Josephine kept her habit of feeding strays, though now she had a proper ranch where dogs, cats, and the occasional injured wild creature could find sanctuary. Over the years, their household included at any given time at least 3 dogs, a rotating cast of barn cats, and once a young deer that James had found injured in the woods, and insisted they nurse back to health. "You are turning our ranch into a menagerie," Nathaniel teased, but he helped her just as much as the children did, building shelters and hauling water and never complaining about the extra mouths to feed. When James was 8 and Margaret was 5, Josephine gave birth to twin boys they named Daniel and Samuel. The twins were identical, with Nathaniel's dark coloring and Josephine's stubbornness, and they kept the entire household running in circles trying to keep up with them. James took his role as oldest brother seriously, helping to watch his younger siblings and teaching them to ride as soon as they were old enough to sit a horse. Margaret appointed herself the voice of reason among her brothers, somehow managing to keep them from killing themselves with boyish recklessness at least half the time. The years passed in a blur of work and love, and the daily chaos of raising 4 children on a working ranch. Josephine's hair gained threads of silver, and Nathaniel's face grew lined from years in the sun, but the way he looked at her never changed. He still kissed her every morning before heading out to work and every evening when he came home. He still told her at least once a week that she had a heart worth keeping close, and that he was the luckiest man alive to have earned her love. Aunt Marjorie passed away in the winter of 1889, peacefully in her sleep at the boarding house she had run for nearly 20 years. Josephine grieved deeply for the woman who had given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. But she took comfort in knowing that Aunt Marjorie had lived to see her happily settled and had known all 4 of her grandnieces and nephews. By the time the new decade dawned, Josephine and Nathaniel's ranch was one of the most respected in the Black Hills region. They employed 6 full-time hands and twice that during cattle drives. James, at 17, was already talking about starting his own operation someday. Margaret, at 14, had announced her intention to become a teacher, fulfilling the dream Josephine had once held for herself. The twins, now 10 years old, were still trying to decide whether they wanted to be ranchers, lawmen, or possibly explorers of the Arctic, depending on which day you ask them. One evening in late spring, Josephine and Nathaniel sat on the porch of the house they had built together, watching the sun set over land they owned free and clear. The children were all in bed, and for once, the ranch was quiet except for the usual sounds of cattle, horses, and night birds. "Do you remember the day we met?" Nathaniel asked, taking her hand in his. 14 years of marriage and his touch still made her heart skip. "You scared me half to death, sneaking up behind me like that," Josephine said, smiling at the memory. "I thought I was going to be reported to the sheriff for feeding strays." "I knew right then that you were someone special," Nathaniel said. "You were risking trouble for creatures that could not give you anything in return. That is real kindness, Josephine, the kind that does not calculate cost." "You said I had a heart worth keeping close," Josephine recalled. "And you let me keep it," Nathaniel said. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, the same gesture he had made the day he proposed. "Every day for the past 14 years, you have given me more happiness than I knew existed in the world. You have given me 4 beautiful children, a home, and a life I am proud of. I want you to know that, Josephine. I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." Tears gathered in Josephine's eyes, the good kind. "Loving you has been the greatest joy of mine," she said. "You saw me when I needed to be seen. You valued the parts of me that other people thought were foolish or impractical. You have been my partner in every way that matters." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands and watching the world settle into night. Inside the house, their children slept safely. In the barn, Sadie, now old and gray-muzzled but still beloved, dozed by the door. Across the ranch, the cattle they had worked so hard to raise grazed peacefully. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary life, except that for Josephine, there was nothing ordinary about it at all. She had come to Custer, South Dakota, as a grieving girl with nothing but a dead father's name and a living aunt's charity. She had expected to spend her life making beds and scrubbing floors, grateful for whatever small kindness the world might offer. Instead, she had found love in an alley behind a saloon, given her heart to a cowboy who valued it properly, and built a life more fulfilling than any dream she had dared to dream. Years continued to pass, measured in seasons and cattle drives and children growing. James did indeed start his own ranch when he turned 21, marrying a sensible girl from Rapid City and making Josephine a grandmother by the time she turned 46. Margaret went east to study teaching and returned with a certificate and a fiancé who was a schoolmaster himself. They settled in Custer, where Margaret took over the small schoolhouse and taught reading and arithmetic to a generation of Black Hills children. The twins proved inseparable, and eventually they decided to go into business together, buying land adjacent to the Frost Ranch and running cattle in partnership with their father. By the time Nathaniel turned 50, he could look across thousands of acres and know that everything he saw belonged to family, built on foundations of hard work and honest dealing. Josephine continued to take in strays, both animal and occasionally human. She became known throughout the region as someone who would help people down on their luck, offering work in exchange for meals and a safe place to sleep. More than one drifting cowboy got back on his feet thanks to a few weeks on the Frost Ranch, where Josephine's cooking and Nathaniel's practical advice set them right again. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Nathaniel took Josephine back to Custer and walked with her to the alley behind what had been the Golden Rose Saloon. The saloon had burned down years ago and been replaced with a general store, but the alley was still there, and they stood in the spot where they had first met. 20 years, Nathaniel said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and also like forever. Both at once, Josephine agreed. She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the way only two people who have spent decades together can be. Do you have any regrets? Not a single one, Nathaniel said immediately. I wish I could have given you more children, Josephine admitted. After the twins, she had suffered 2 miscarriages that had broken her heart, and eventually they had accepted that 4 living children was what God intended them to have. 4 healthy children is more blessing than most people ever receive, Nathaniel said gently. And you gave me so much more than children, Josephine. You gave me a home in every sense that matters. You made me a better man just by loving me. They stood together in that alley, 2 people no longer young but still deeply in love, and remembered the scared, hopeful people they had been when they first met. So much had changed, but the essential truth remained the same. Josephine had a heart worth keeping close, and Nathaniel had earned the right to keep it. As the years advanced into the new century, Josephine and Nathaniel gradually handed over the day-to-day operations of the ranch to their sons. They remained active and involved, but they also allowed themselves the luxury of slower mornings and afternoon naps and evenings, spent simply enjoying each other's company. Grandchildren arrived with delightful regularity, and Josephine discovered that being a grandmother was somehow even more wonderful than being a mother, with all the joy and far less of the worry. She taught her grandchildren the lessons her father had taught her, about judging people by how they treated those who could not fight back, about the importance of kindness even when it was not convenient, about working hard and dealing honestly. She told them stories about feeding stray dogs behind a saloon and meeting a cowboy who saw past her ordinary exterior to something worth treasuring. Nathaniel, for his part, taught the grandchildren to ride and rope, and everything else they needed to know about ranch life. But more than practical skills, he taught them by example what it meant to be a good husband, father, and neighbor. He showed them that real strength included gentleness, that men secure in themselves did not need to prove their toughness through cruelty, and that love was something you chose to give every single day, not just on wedding days and anniversaries. On a spring morning in 1910, Josephine woke to find Nathaniel already up, which was unusual. She found him on the porch, watching the sunrise, and she saw something in his face that made her heart clench. "What is it?" she asked, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "I was just thinking how grateful I am," Nathaniel said quietly. 33 years married, and I still wake up amazed that you chose me." "I will always choose you," Josephine said fiercely, "in this life and whatever comes after." "I know," Nathaniel said. He turned to look at her, and his eyes held all the love of more than 3 decades together. "I want you to know something, Josephine. Whatever happens, whenever my time comes, I will have lived a full and happy life. Because of you. Because you had a heart worth keeping close and you trusted me to keep it." "Nathaniel," Josephine started, frightened by the finality in his tone. "I am not going anywhere today," he assured her, squeezing her hand. "I just wanted you to know. I wanted to say it out loud while I have the chance." They sat together as the sun rose higher, and Josephine held his hand tighter than perhaps she needed to, as if her grip alone could keep him with her forever. Nathaniel lived another 8 years, healthy and active until a bad fall from a horse when he was 73 damaged something inside him that could not be repaired. He lingered for 3 weeks, lucid and calm, saying goodbye to his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came from across the territory to sit with him. But it was Josephine he wanted beside him most, and she rarely left his bedside except when the children insisted she needed to rest. On his last morning, with spring sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and Josephine holding his hand, Nathaniel looked at her with perfect clarity and said, "Thank you for every day. Thank you for the love and the life and the family. Thank you for being exactly who you are." "Thank you for seeing me," Josephine whispered through tears. "Thank you for valuing my heart." "Always," Nathaniel breathed, and then he closed his eyes and slipped away so peacefully that for a moment Josephine was not sure he was really gone. The grief was immense and overwhelming, even though she had known it was coming. She had loved Nathaniel for 41 years, had built an entire life around their partnership, and now she had to learn how to exist without him. But she was surrounded by family, by children and grandchildren who carried forward the values she and Nathaniel had taught them. And gradually, she found her way to a place where she could remember with joy rather than only pain. Josephine lived another 7 years, spending her time helping with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, tending her garden, and continuing to take in whatever stray creatures found their way to her door. On her last day, sitting in the sun on the porch of the house she and Nathaniel had built together, surrounded by 3 generations of descendants, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had started with nothing but grief and a carpetbag, standing in an alley feeding strays because kindness was the only thing she knew how to give. She had been seen and valued by a cowboy with creek water eyes who told her she had a heart worth keeping close. She had said yes to love, yes to building a life in a harsh land, yes to all the joys and sorrows that came with opening her heart fully. And in return, she had been given everything that mattered. Love that lasted a lifetime, children who carried forward the best of what she and Nathaniel had been, and the deep satisfaction of knowing she had lived fully and well. She had fed hungry dogs in an alley behind a saloon, and she had been repaid with a love story that spanned decades and generations. As her eyes grew heavy in the afternoon sun, Josephine thought she could hear Nathaniel's voice calling her name, and she smiled. She had kept his heart close for 41 years on earth, and now she would keep it close for whatever came next. She had been afraid when she first came west, uncertain and grieving, but she had found courage in unexpected places. She had found it in the trust of stray dogs who let her feed them. She had found it in the words of a cowboy who saw past her ordinary appearance to something extraordinary. She had found it in the choice to say yes to love, even when the future was uncertain. And she had found it again and again in the daily work of building a life, raising children, running a ranch, and choosing kindness even when it was hard. The sun was warm on her face, and the voices of her grandchildren playing in the yard were sweet as music. And Josephine Owens Frost closed her eyes content in the knowledge that she had lived a life worth living, loved deeply and well, and left behind a legacy of kindness that would continue long after she was gone. In the alley behind what had once been the Golden Rose Saloon, where a scared young woman had fed stray dogs and met a cowboy who changed her life forever, the spring flowers bloomed wild and beautiful, growing through cracks in the old foundation. They were a small thing, those flowers, barely noticed by the people who passed by going about their busy days. But they grew strong and returned every year, persistent and lovely, a perfect symbol of what could flourish when someone had the courage to show kindness in hard places and the wisdom to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected forms. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this world, Josephine and Nathaniel were together again, walking hand in hand through fields of endless spring, their hearts still close after all the years and all the miles, proof that love built on foundations of kindness and respect could endure anything, even death itself.